block break for block number 2. We have with us a wonderful colleague, a dear friend, and an exceptional teacher. Elizabeth Coggins has joined Robert Moore and myself this morning for our block break video to talk about the upcoming election. We know elections are always busy times on college campuses, and CC is no different, and it's no different this year because we're in a virtual environment. Our students, our organization, CC Votes, have already been engaged in election activities, and that's just wonderful. But today with Professor Coggins, Robert and I just want to talk a little bit more about the role of a liberal arts education in the civic process vis-a-vis an election. My first question to Professor Coggins, and it's great to see you.
Likewise.
Could you just give us some of your thoughts on why college students need to be engaged in the election process and how it relates to what we do at CC?
Sure. Yes. I love talking about civic engagement. I love talking about why it's important that students are a part of that process and what it looks like beyond just voting. Democracy depends on civic engagement, quite simply, right? Without an informed and critically involved public, democracy just cannot work. But civic engagement is also really mutually beneficial. Most people just want to be known and want to be understood. And engaging with other people often allows us to learn things and understand things that we just didn't know from virtue of our own sort of personal experience. We tend to live, maybe even more so now, in these customized communities that have allowed us to be around people who look like us and feel like us and who act like us. And at best, that's not just reality. And at worst, it's robbing us of all developing a deep understanding of our own country, its history, this particular moment, the possibilities for the future, and the rich diversity that makes up the world in which we live. And not doing that, not being involved and engaged, that's where democracy dies, where bridges are abandoned and heads are turned the other way. And that's why really civic engagement is so critical.
Great.
So Professor Coggins, at this particular moment, how is COVID-19 impacting the election process and our students' abilities to get involved in that process?
You know, it is that, and we have to recognize that. But in some ways, to me, it seems that our students are more engaged than they ever have been this year.
Absolutely.
Our very own CC Votes, as what was just mentioned, that incredible organization coordinates numerous programs to increase voter turnout and voter engagement, even in this era of COVID in which we're living. They have crafted a nonpartisan voting guide. They provide lots of ideas for students of how they can engage, even virtually. They provided a ballot drop box on campus. More than anything, though, this particular group of people make participation easier, and they make the process more understandable. And I think that really goes a long way in demystifying the process for our students who may be focused on a lot of things and other things in all different sorts of places across the country, but still want to be, a good citizen and still want to be involved in the electoral process. Their work, by the way, you probably know this, has nearly doubled voter turnout among CC students since 2014. And I really can't wait to see what happens, what those numbers look like in 2020. Part of their work and the work really is helping our students understand that politics is incredibly relevant to their everyday lives, not just on November 3rd, but a part of their everyday lives. And I think that's the work that they've done. And that's why they've enhanced voter engagement and voter participation and just actual turnout so much, because they have helped students see that politics is relevant to the way they live, on a day-to-day basis.
Elizabeth, you and I have talked before about the importance of discourse and debates, and
Sure.
we've oftentimes deconstructed presidential debates. How does political discourse look and feel in these current times?
Yeah, political discourse and sort of talking across the aisle has changed a lot over the past few decades. And we can all, even if we're not really, observing that from a political science sort of mathematical point of view, we can feel it. We know that it feels different. And I think that discourse and dialogue, sort of broadly speaking, are deeply tied to the makeup of the public, right? And of course, the makeup of those really critical places like Congress as well. And of course, the presidency and the Supreme Court, all of these sort of critical components of the American democracy are really important in helping us understand what discourse and dialogue look like. And in many ways, those big components kind of set the stage for what the rest of us sort of observe and feel, and how they kind of set the tone for how we should be talking and speaking to each other. But beyond that, we hear a lot of talk in the media about deep polarization in this country. And I think it's really worth pushing back some on that. It's not really true to say that we are a deeply polarized country. It's more accurate to say really that we're better sorted than we used to be, which basically means that those with more liberal views tend to call themselves Democrats more than they used to decades ago. And those with more conservative views tend to call themselves Republicans now. And the differences between the two partisan groups have increased on some topics, but it's really critical to recognize that everyday citizens typically do not reside at the far poles, right? We don't live there, right? The way that Congress people do. But what happens a lot is I think the media tends to focus on what divides us, and the people who define that division very well. The media is really more like a megaphone for more polar views, and heightens the belief that we are polarized in the mass electorate. But when we look to public opinion, for instance, across a host of different hard or even hot button issues, we find a lot of areas of bipartisan support in this country. Just a few examples, if you like public opinion, like the way that I do.
Yes.
More than 85% of Americans are in favor of requiring background checks on gun purchases, for example. 75% of Americans think that the federal government should play a major role in protecting the earth. 66% of Americans believe and support a pathway to citizenship for non-citizens who live in this country. So that doesn't look like a severely polarized country to me. But it would be, I'd be remiss, of course, not to sort of also highlight that we're living in a unique, in some ways volatile and really important political moment. There are many important, if not, more important topics of public opinion where we are more divided. Politics, I think more than anything, and we've talked about this, President Edmonds, about how politics is just more personal now in many ways than it used to be, and it feels more personal. There's this great, great in some ways, but a really good sort of example of how much more personal it is to us that I always share with my students. So in 1960, a polling survey asked partisans, so people who call themselves Republicans or people who call themselves Democrats, if they'd be upset if a child of theirs married someone from the other political party. Anybody want to guess how many Republicans and Democrats said they'd be upset about that in 1960?
35%.
Right.
4% of Democrats and
Wow.
4% of Republicans
Wow.
said that they'd be upset. Isn't that wild?
Wow.
Yes.
Yes. So what do you think about, what if we were to ask that in 2020?
Oh my gosh.
So these are people who actually call themselves Republicans or Democrats, right? So not moderates or not sort of Independents. What do you think that those numbers look like in 2020?
25%.
President Edmonds?
40%.
Yeah, 45% of Democrats
Whoa.
and 35% of Republicans, those who self-identify with the party, say they would be upset. So not just, oh, I don't care, or, something not like actually upset if a child of theirs married someone from the other political party. So that's a pretty big shift, right? And that's an important shift. And it's something we have to sort of juxtapose against the knowledge that a lot of politics we do agree on, right? But some things maybe not so much. So, but it doesn't mean though that we shouldn't work hard, incredibly hard, to try to understand those who have different, policy views than us. That does not mean we shouldn't focus on what ties us together, where the bridges are. And that I try to do a lot of that work in my own classroom around politics and trying to understand why and how people feel the way that they do.
Well, let's pursue that some more. So could you talk broadly about how faculty on the liberal arts campus work to draw out these different perspectives that can be considered in depth in a kind of a respectful manner?
Yeah, it's hard. Dialogue, really listening. That is the hardest work of politics. That is plain and simple true, I believe. I know lots of folks at CC are doing great work around drawing in multiple perspectives. I can talk a little bit about the way that I do it in my own classroom. But what I try to do is really add a deeply reflective component to the literature that we study, simply put. So for example, I've just finished, an hour ago, my second block class. It's focused on the thinking about how and why people choose sort of teams, liberals or conservatives, right, in the way that they do in the United States. So we start by considering more of a micro level approach to these political attachments. What personality traits, for example, are most aligned with these ideological leanings? What role do predispositions play? So when we come into the world, sort of what role do predispositions and personality traits, and how does morality figure into this equation? And then, so we sort of take on the literature, and then we consider ourselves, our own personalities and predispositions and moral compasses. And we try to have conversations, productive conversations, with folks who come to their own ideological teams from very different moral compasses and personalities and predispositions. I like to get my students comfortable with that sort of dwelling in tension, right? So sort of living there, live in that tension. Because we really are our greatest community when as President Obama says, we in his first inaugural address, he said something about our fists being clenched, when we sort of unclench our fists and reach out and grab other folks and bring them into our circle, whatever that may be, and try to bridge those divides within our own community. So I try to do that in my own classes by considering both the literature and a personal kind of experience alongside that, and reminding students that they are sort of what we're studying, and so are the people in the community, and so are the people in the rest of the United States and the rest of the country.
Earlier, Elizabeth, you used the word, and I couldn't wait to circle back to it, that we're more sorted now than what we were.
Yeah.
Is that true also based on generations? So are there topics or issues that affect different generations in a different way as we go into this election?
Short answer, yes. I think that the way that our students, for example, experience politics is very different than the way that their own parents did, and obviously their grandparents as well. So sorted in that sense, I think what our students understand is a much more sort of polar world in a way that their own parents and their grandparents didn't, right? So you can think about things like, moderate Democrats, or even, liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats, right? In a way that we don't experience in the world now. So that's sort of what I mean by sorted. But another really interesting thing that comes to mind in thinking, based on what you're saying, is sort of what is at, like the top of the agenda for people, based on generational differences, right? So there's this great Gallup poll that's asked, every week to a variety of Americans, and they ask them, what's the most important problem facing the country today? Right. So what we have is a very predictable response to that based on age often. Wow. Right. And so we have our students and younger people saying things like racial tension, saying things like police brutality, COVID, right, climate change, whereas we have older generations saying things like healthcare, right? So we do see people sorted not just ideologically and politically, but we also see them bringing to the table very different topics and issues that matter to them.
Well, speaking of bringing to the table, we have a tradition at this college every 4 years to have a series that focuses on the election. That's not occurring. I wanted to ask you to speak about future plans for the Sonderman series.
Yeah, sure. So it's with much regret that we decided not to hold the Sonderman Presidential Symposium this year. As you mentioned, President Moore, every 4 years. It is, when I came to CC, we had one shortly after I came, and it's the most fun I've had organizing and being a part of an event. But for those who have heard about this, we bring in sort of exciting political figures and journalists and academics to talk about and sort of frame the election that's coming up, and we bring these people into our classes, and they help us teach, and they help us wade through reading, and we disagree with them, and we engage with them, and we ask them hard questions. And this year, we, because of COVID-19, would have needed to have had a fully virtual event. And we just didn't think for this one particular event that we could get the same feel the same kind of experience for our students. That being said, other professors in political science, and I know people across the college, are doing lots of sort of Zoom conversations with neat figures who our students get to grill and ask questions to. But as far as hosting a sort of series of events that led up to the election, we wanted to wait until we could hopefully do something in person. So we talked about it in the department and said it would be really interesting to do something after the election as sort of a looking back, right? And we hope that will allot us some time to reflect on what happened during this particularly unusual election cycle, and help us to consider the best voices to bring in to help us understand sort of in a looking back way. So we're just trying to do it a different way that meets the times, and sort of understands the time in which we live. But for me, I think it will be different, but just as beneficial to our students and to our faculty and our staff, and the whole, as you both know, this is a big community event. We draw lots of people from the community. So I really think that more of a reflection event will be a nice change up, really.
Elizabeth, I remember 4 years ago, you and I were at a dinner and we were discussing October surprises. Wow, yeah. There have been a ton of fall surprises in the election. What do you think? Do you think there are any more October surprises, or are we, or is it just done? I mean, I loved our conversation about the impact of October surprises on election. What do you think?
I'm about done with surprises. I'm ready for some, predictability. I'm a scientist, social scientist. I like to be able to notice patterns and predict what's coming next. You know, it's so interesting you say that, President Edmonds. My students just finished up a project in this class I teach on ideology, and they were sort of evaluating the moral and ideological strategy of a particular campaign happening right now. And in the third part of the project, I asked them to predict what will happen in, you know, on November 3rd or in the days following, what will happen in that actual election that they are evaluating. And I told them that I couldn't wait to read what they wrote so I could say that I came up with those excellent predictions, because I just don't know anymore. We look at one set of my students were looking at the campaign in South Carolina between Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison, which is a really fascinating campaign, especially to predict the outcome of, right, in a state like South Carolina that is so, they call it sunburnt, right? It's so red, right? In many ways, political commentators call it that, and say, we predict, you know, a Trump win in that state. But how would we understand a Jamie Harrison win on the same ballot as a Trump win, right? And so we talk about that, what happens morally and ideologically in the minds of Americans to cast a ballot in that way. So as far as surprises go, though, pre-election, I'm all surprised out. I'm hoping for no more. I'm ready for some predictability for sure.
How do we continue to help all of us, our faculty, staff, students, and alums and friends, really exercise our voice in democracy? Voting is just part of it. How do we really help people understand the importance of their voice and empower people to use their voice, which is why I'm really thankful to the work that CC Votes does. Yes. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You know, I think a lot about civic engagement. I think a lot about my students and their sort of lives right now and their future lives, and how we instill in them not only sort of an understanding about how politics is part of their everyday lives, but also a passion for that. And one thing I work hard to do, and I know this is true of my colleagues as well, is not just help them understand that, but also demonstrate to them ways in which they can be involved in ways that are sustainable over time. But I think that philosophy of civic engagement, that philosophy of talking to them about the mutual benefit, that politics is really just about getting to know people and understand people, and understanding that that's their most sort of important desire, if you will, to be understood and known, and that's really what politics is about. I think really demystifies it in ways, as I said earlier, but I think that is one of the most critical components of it, is demystifying the process for them, saying you don't need to know the rules of the Senate Judiciary Committee to be an informed voice, right? And I think that often is the biggest barrier, is that politics is complicated, it looks messy, it looks divisive. And I try to work against all three of those notions, that it can be messy. It doesn't have to be divisive. We can take those fists, right, open them up. But more importantly, demonstrating to them, I think that it's a part of their everyday lives, and it affects the very roads that they drive on and the air that they breathe.
Great. President Moore, do you have another question?
Well, I wanted to explore for just a minute what's happening in the state of Colorado. I believe we have 11 different initiatives on the ballot, which the Denver Post today just published page after page after page of what those are. And so how do people go about approaching that when you live in a state where it's fairly easy, I believe, you can comment on this, but it's easy to bring issues to the ballot for the, quote, voters to decide. And some of these are very complex issues.
They are complex, and they are made even more complex by the way that they are written on the ballot. I don't know if you've gotten your ballot yet and a chance to open them. I have mine right here, in fact, but they are quite difficult to understand, especially the way that they're written. But we are really lucky in this state, and especially at this college, to have resources for helping us understand those. And I think, you know, I am a professor of political science and I do my research. I don't know what things mean just by reading them on the ballot. And I think we have to develop those trusted sources, which is why it's unique to have a source like CC Votes, the way that we have on this campus doing the work that they're doing and providing the information that they're providing. I read their ballot guide. It's a nonpartisan ballot guide that explains what each topic is. And you know, I like to tell my students it's not hard to be a good citizen, but it does take a little bit of work. And this is the work. We are 20 days out from, you know, a critical election in this country. And to reap the benefits of living in a democracy as we do, one must also put in a little bit of work. And so for me, just like anyone else, that means reading a guide, figuring out these issues, using a source that you trust, and perhaps most importantly, reading the view of the other side as well, and trying to understand these issues from both sides and making your own decision. That's when you know you've made it, right? When you go to a source from the other side and try to understand an issue the other way and then make your own decision.
Wow, this has just been, I've just had a blast, and I've loved our conversation, and it's just brought back so many memories, because you and I seem to do this every presidential election, and I'm glad we were able to do it in a virtual world. You know that CC has canceled classes on election day. From your role as a political scientist and as a faculty member, I'd love to know your thoughts on that just before we end.
I was really excited to see that. I thought that was a brave move, a bold move, a necessary one. And hopefully, I think a lot of the best ideas start at universities and colleges. And it's unusual in a democracy like our own not to have voting day, election day, as a day off. And so I thought it was bold, but also quite necessary, and hopefully sets the tone for other institutions. We take, maybe not at CC, but a lot of sort of, you know, banks take a lot of holidays in this country, and I can't quite square why it is they don't take off November 3rd, or why they don't take off, you know, that first Tuesday. So CC has been an example for the community, for universities and colleges across the country on many other dimensions as well. And I saw this just as CC taking that next bold, you know, progressive step that it should be taking.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's great to see y'all.
Finishing your block 2. This is an exciting and wonderful and informative way to start block break. Great to see you again.
Agreed.
I'm glad we were able to continue our tradition of election conversations and discussions, even if we had to do it virtually. Great.
Me too, and I'll look forward to seeing both of you at the dinner table in the spring for our Sonderman Symposium as we reflect back on the next 20 days.
We'll be there.
Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.